Hi, I'm Linda Chatwin. I'm with UL, and I'm here at MasterControl today to share with you some ideas on how to prepare for the Medical Device Directive transition. We're going to talk a bit about the overview of the MDR and then understanding how to transition from it with some suggestions that I have made here. Of course, it's not a final regulation yet, and so getting there is still going to take some time, but at least there's some planning that can be done. I'm going to talk a bit about what the new notified body requirements are. There's a lot going on with the notified bodies and what they have to qualify to do. The unique device identification rule is being incorporated into this regulation, so it'll be a requirement on companies to do the UDI requirements as well. And then we'll talk a bit about the impact on the CE certifications. So just to give you an overview on the medical device regulation, there has been 28 pages of preamble alone in this document. Now that's kind of important to us attorneys. We always look to the preamble to see what the requirements are or what the thought process was in the regulators when they put a regulation in place. So preamble has important information in it. There's 10 chapters now in this new regulation. Those of you who know the old MDD know that there were a number of articles in it, but with this MDR, they've divided it into 10 chapters and there's multiple articles per chapter. There are 16 annexes included, so in total we have 306 pages now with lovely nighttime reading. There is a formal procedure in place to translate all of the regulation into the EU member languages, and then there'll be a formal publication. We expect that publication to be any time now, and then there'll be a 3-year transition period for companies to change from the MDD over to the MDR. So to give a little bit of an idea of the organization of the MDR, Chapter 1 has the scope and definitions. Now I say that the definitions are always quite important to take a look at, because as you go through the MDR and you come to terms that you think might mean one thing, to regulators they sometimes mean something else. So it's really important to look at those definitions and make sure you're on the same page with the regulators. Chapter 2 is about making available and putting the devices onto the marketplace, the obligations of what they call the economic operators, which really includes the manufacturers, the authorized representatives, the competent authorities, distributors, and so forth. So they've really expanded who the economic operators are. Reprocessing of devices is covered here, as well as the CE marking and the free movement of goods. Chapter 3 covers the identification and traceability of devices, the registration of devices, and the economic operators in a registration system, and then the summary of safety and clinical performances that will be required, and how the European Data Bank for medical devices will be put into play. Chapter 4 is all about notified bodies and what's going to have to be done with those notified bodies. There's going to be a lot of process that they have to go through to requalify to be notified bodies. We'll talk more about that in a bit, but suffice it to say that probably fewer notified bodies will be qualified going forward. Chapter 5 is about the classification and conformity assessment routes and rules. Chapter 6 is the clinical evaluation and clinical investigations, which have been significantly updated and increased in the requirements. Chapter 7 is post-market surveillance, vigilance, and market surveillance. Chapter 8 is the cooperation between member states, medical device coordination group, which I'll talk more about what that group is, expert laboratories and panels and device registers. Chapter 9 is about confidentiality and data protection with funding and penalties involved. And then there's some final provisions in Chapter 10. Now there have been a lot of questions about what the Brexit issues are going to be with the medical device regulation going forward. And so I just wanted to note here that on January the 17th, Theresa May clarified that the UK's stance will be that the medical device regulation will be adopted into British law. And so that will provide continuity, and companies will be able to depend on using the medical device regulation components within the within the UK as well as the European Union. So now about the annexes. As I mentioned, there are 16. The first one is about the general safety and performance requirements. Second is technical documentation, so what's going to be required in the technical files. The 2A is actually technical documentation that has to be pulled in as a result of post-market surveillance. And then the third annex is about the declaration of conformity, and fourth is the CE marking of conformity. The fifth annex is about information that has to be submitted with regards to the UDI and how the UDI is going to operate through the Eudamed system and reporting in that global system. The sixth annex is about the requirements that notified bodies are going to have to meet. Then 7 is about classification criteria. Number 8, conformity assessment routes, and it will be based on a quality management system as it is currently. The 9th annex is about conformity assessment based on type examination. 10 is about the product conformity verification. 11 is procedure about custom-made devices. 12 is the certificates that will be issued by the notified body and what those requirements will be. The 13th annex is about clinical evaluation and post-market clinical follow-up that will be required on certain types of products going forward. The 13th annex is about clinical investigations and what those requirements will entail. The 15th annex is the list of products that have not historically had an intended medical purpose, but they are now being pulled into some requirements in the medical device regulation. And finally, the 16th annex is a correlation table that will show how this regulation correlates to other directives and regulations. So next we'll talk a bit about the timeline and what can be expected as the MDR becomes final with its publication. I said here the 2nd of March as a publication date. Of course, that's not anything that we know for sure, but it just gave a starting point. Then we're showing that there's quite a long area of time here that notified bodies have to be redesignated. So that means that they have a lot of work to qualify with the competent authorities to be shown as a continuing and qualified notified body under the medical device regulation moving forward. And you'll see that that period of time is something around 18 months that they expect to use to re-qualify those notified bodies. In 2019, early 2019, we expect that the first medical device regulation CE certificates will be issued. Again, that will depend upon the actual timeline from the publication of the regulation. And then by 2020, early in 2020, the full application of the medical device regulation will be in place, and so it will no longer be possible to issue CE marks under the MDD. All of them will be under the MDR going forward. So you'll see that during this period of time, there's going to be a lot of implementing and delegated acts that will be put into place in the European Union, and those are provided for in the medical device regulation. So what are some of the business applications of the MDR? Well, first of all, there's some things that have to be considered in the compliance timelines and planning in the organization. So there's going to be some reclassification and upclassification of products. So existing products are going to have to be evaluated whether they still apply under the new classification rules or whether there will be some changes. Undoubtedly, there will be some technical file revisions and updates that will need to be put into place and planned for. Remember that there will be reduced notified body capacity. That means there'll probably be fewer notified bodies who will be recertified and able to issue certificates under this new MDR. What that means for a company, of course, is that it will be more difficult to get your assessments done, and you'll need to work with your notified bodies early to ensure that you have that work in place. There are increased requirements for vigilance and post-market surveillance, and the UDI and registration of products is completely new in this regulation. Of course, under the FDA, we've seen the UDI becoming implemented in the US, and there are a lot of things that are similar to the US system in the European idea, but there are some things that are different, so there'll need to be some gap assessments made on that. There will be transparency of a lot of information that has not been transparent before, so there'll be requirements for putting information into the Eudamed database. And then, of course, you'll have to have some increased personnel training and partner training, so there'll be a lot of training opportunities and responsibilities going forward to meet these requirements. So under the regulation, there are general obligations of the manufacturer that are stated, and these really include ensuring that devices are designed and manufactured in accordance with the regulation itself. So that means that there must be a very clear understanding of what the requirements under the regulation are. You need to establish, execute, and maintain a document system for risk management. The risk management responsibilities under the quality system regulations and standards are much more intense than they have been in the past, and so it will be important to have a good, solid, strong risk management system. You will need to conduct clinical evaluations, which will include a post-market clinical follow-up. So on your clinical evaluation reports, you'll be expected to every so often, depending on the types of products that you have, look into the post-market activities and update those clinical evaluation reports. And then you have to prepare and update technical documentation as specified in the regulation, and that allows the conformity assessment by the notified body. So there'll be some significant changes in the technical files, and the notified bodies will be responsible to look into the technical files at a much deeper level. There are some obligations on distributors and importers and etc. So the economic operators that are involved in the marketing of the devices. Distributors will end up assuming the obligations of manufacturers if they make a product available on the marketplace under their own name or under an agreement where the manufacturer is not known. So if the manufacturer has an agreement that their name also appears on the product, then the manufacturers retain that legal obligation. Also, if they make changes to the intended purpose of a device, or they modify a device that's already on the marketplace so that the requirements may be affected, they are taking obligations of manufacturing on for those purposes. So what I've done here is tried to give some ideas of things that need to be thought about and planned for as you look at the requirements in the medical device regulation. So under the heading of making available devices, obligations of the economic operators, reprocessing, CE marking, and the free movement of goods, things that you'll need to think about are really establishing and maintaining that risk management system. As I mentioned before, that's going to be very important and very pervasive throughout the whole regulation and the requirements in it. You will need to assess the medical devices that you provide as a service. So medical device as a software would be subject, of course, to CE marking and the classification requirements will need to be looked at very closely for those. You'll need to assess the own brand labeling that you might have or that you provide to another company. There'll need to be a technical file for both the manufacturer as well as the own brand labeler. So they'll have to have, each one of them will have to have a technical file. You'll want to make a gap assessment regarding incident reporting and field corrective actions and take a look at how you collect that information now and how you'll collect it in the future to meet the requirements of the regulation. There is also a requirement now to have what's called an officer for regulatory compliance. So you'll need to select and qualify a candidate for that position. You'll want to review your relationship with all of your distributors and importers to ensure that they are in compliance, because you may, as a manufacturer, have some liability for their actions. And so you'll want to make sure that the contractual agreements meet what you will need to show compliance under the regulation. There are some new responsibilities for authorized representatives, so you'll need to review your relationship with them, what their responsibilities are, and you'll need to have a contractual relationship with them that spells out what their responsibilities are. We'll talk a little bit more later about what the authorized rep will be responsible for. And then, of course, looking at your quality management system. So if you're under ISO 13485, you'll need to move to the 2016 version. There are some significant changes between the old 2007 and the 2016 version, and it will be necessary to up your certificate to those requirements. You'll want to review your repackaging, relabeling, and reprocessing if you're engaged in those activities. And that actually would also include if you're reusing components. So if you have medical devices that you manufacture, you take medical devices back at the end of life, you take some of those components out of those products and reuse them in new devices. There'll need to be some thought given into what sort of reprocessing those components need to go through and what their lifetime would be. And then you'll really need to review the declaration of conformity requirements against the current model and what the requirements will be in the regulation. Also take a look at relationships with parts manufacturers. There's going to be more responsibility on you as a manufacturer to look at your supply chain and make sure that you have all of the ducks in a row to ensure that the materials that you get from them meet your specifications and can be relied upon for safety. So again, some additional information in this same area of the regulation. There are not a great deal of common specifications that you can depend on for updating your information in the medical device regulation. So there will be some work put into these common specifications. The Commission may consult with this medical device coordination group to help adopt a number of these. And so you can look as you go forward over the transition period for some of these to be coming out. And of course, as we stated before, the manufacturer will have an obligation to establish an effective UDI system. The quality management system and risk management processes are more specific and have more prescriptive requirements in them now. There are some field safety corrective actions that you need to take a look at when serious injuries occur, how you report those into the Commission or into the Eudamed database, and what you do with your clinical evaluation reports. And then what you do with corrective and preventive actions and how you verify those is a very important consideration. For the authorized representative, I mentioned there is increased liability for these folks now. They have a stated responsibility that they must keep available the technical files and keep those technical files or ensure that they are updated correctly. They have to cooperate with the competent authorities on preventive and corrective actions that may be necessary to ensure the safety of the device that's on the marketplace. And they will be liable for defective devices, and so it's going to be very important to them that they are ensured that as manufacturers they have been given appropriate information to show that the devices are safe and effective. And they will have the ability to terminate their contract with a manufacturer if they feel that the manufacturer is acting contrary to their obligations under the regulation. So under the general area of identification and traceability of devices, registration, and economic operators, the summary of safety and clinical performance, and the European Data Bank, things that you'll want to take into account and plan for is really assessing the changes to your distribution agreements with the traceability and the UDI issues in mind. And so there's going to be responsibilities that will need to be defined on who will be doing the traceability activities and who will be responsible for placing the UDIs and for reporting into the Eudamed database. You'll need to have traceability systems in place and make sure that you've designed systems that take into account your supply chain, where product is coming from and how you are maintaining your safety aspects on the supply chain itself. And then of course you will need a UDI plan, so you'll need to include how you're going to mark the devices. There'll be some higher level of packaging requirements as well as on the primary device itself, and then reporting into the technical file as well as the Eudamed database. You'll need to identify information that has to be included in the summary of safety and performance reports that will need to be maintained, and that has to do with Class 3 devices and implantables. And then there will be a single registration system that will identify who the manufacturer is, who the authorized rep is that ties to that manufacturer, and importers and distributors and so forth. So all of this will be included in that single registration system. Now I wanted to talk for a few moments about labels and labeling and give some of the definitional issues. So a label is any written, printed, or graphic information that appears either on the device or the packaging of each unit, or on the packaging for multiple devices. You want to ensure that device is accompanied by information that's required in an official European language. And so that language will be determined by the member state where the devices are available. The particulars on the label need to be indelible, easily legible, and comprehensible to the intended user or patients. There is going to be some significant prohibitions on the use of text, names, trademarks, and pictures or other signs that could mislead the user or the patient with regards to the device's intended purpose, safety, and performance. So you have to be able to ensure that they don't get the idea that the device is intended for a use other than what's cleared in the device literature and information on the technical files. So this includes making sure that you're not ascribing functions and properties to the device that it does not have. You don't want to create any false impressions regarding the treatment or diagnosis or functions or properties of the device. You want to make sure that you aren't failing to inform of any likely risks that are associated with the use of the product. So you'll need to identify potential risks of using the device. And then you don't want to suggest uses of the product other than those that are declared in the intended use when the conformity assessment was carried out. So again, reaching into this area, there will be a requirement of medical device nomenclature to facilitate placing information into the Eudamed database about the devices. So that means that the the GMDN codes will need to be used. For the UDI itself, there'll be a device identifier plus a production identifier if it's applicable. And of course, there will be final list published of which devices are going to require the production identifier as well as the device identifier. There will be the UDI database established, which is interpreted to mean at this point the Eudamed database. The UDI will be the basis of reporting serious incidents and field safety corrective actions. So on those items, they will be reported into the Eudamed and they must include the UDI as well. UDIs must be kept up to date, so if model changes occur or design changes occur, you will need to evaluate whether you need to have a new UDI in place. And then the product information must be entered into the database, the Eudamed database, prior to placing the devices on the market. There will be a summary of safety and clinical performance requirement for Class 3 and implantable devices. That report information will need to include the UDI information as well as the specifics about the safety and clinical performance. And there will be detailed requirements that you will find about these reports that must be generated in the Medical Device Regulation when it's published. And as I mentioned, there'll be this single registration number in place that will be identifying who the manufacturer and the economic operators are with respect to each product. Now there's an idea about the UDIs and who can issue a UDI. As we know, in the US, there are 3 agencies that have been authorized by the FDA to issue UDIs. In Europe, they will also identify who will be able to issue UDIs. Right now, they have at least identified the GS1 group as able to issue them. They must show that they have an adequate system to assign UDIs and identify the products throughout their distribution and use. The system for assignment of UDIs has to conform with relevant international standards, and they must be able to provide access to their system for all interested users that want to take a look at how they came about to issue UDIs. They also have to undertake an agreement to operate their system at least for 10 years after they assign UDIs, and they must make the information available to the Commission and member states regarding how they assign the UDIs. They also must have an agreement that they will remain in compliance with the criteria for designation of terms and designation under the UDI requirements. So what's going to be required with UDIs? Well, a device identifier that will provide access to information that shows the quantity of product per package. The declaration of conformity will need to show the UDI and the DI on it. The way that a device is controlled, meaning the expiration date, manufacturing date, lot or batch number, etc. If it's applicable, the unit of use for the device needs to be identified in the database, and then the name and address of the manufacturer as indicated on the label. Also, the name and address of the authorized representative as it's indicated on the labeling. The medical device nomenclature code has to be included, the risk class of the device, the trade or brand name of the device if that's applicable, the device model, reference, or catalog number, if there's a clinical size involved, so that would include volume, length, gauge, diameter, that must be included in the database. And then if you want to, you don't have to, you can give an additional product description. I believe it's a good idea to give the product description because you need to think of this database as a catalog of all of the devices that are available on the European market. So it's an opportunity for you to describe a bit about what the devices are. If you have storage conditions or handling and use conditions, you'll want to include that in the database and also in the instructions for use. And then if you have additional trade names that the device might be known as, you can also include that. You need to label whether it's a single-use device or not, and if it's applicable, if there's a restricted number of reuses. You need to show whether the device is packaged as sterile and if it has to be sterilized before use. You need to show whether it has latex involved in either the device or the packaging, and if it's labeled in accordance with the labeling requirements under the regulation. There needs to be a URL for additional information. So for instance, if you provide electronic instructions for use, you would indicate that in the Eudamed database. If you have critical warnings or contraindications that need to be stated, then you would include that in your registration as well. And then a status on the device marketing attributes. So is it on the market? Has it been recalled? Is it no longer available? And then a production identifier will identify the product's unit and applicable number of devices in the packaging. So here on the slide you will see a representative UDI label, and on this label you will see that under the human readable interpretation, the first part of the UDI includes the global trade number. The second part is the date of manufacture. The third part is the lot number. And then the fourth part is the serial number. So this is just representative of how a UDI might be introduced. The UDI carrier has to be placed on the label of the device itself and all higher levels of packaging. So that means if you sell the device in packages of 10, 20 boxes, cases, so forth, each one of those higher levels need to have a UDI on them as well. That does not include the shipping containers, however, so they're not required to have the UDI on the shipping containers. You must use the UDI whenever you're reporting serious incidents or field safety correction actions. And the basic UDI identifier has to appear on your EU Declaration of Conformity. You, as a manufacturer, must keep a list of all applied UDIs as part of your technical documentation, and the economic operators need to store, keep, and have available, preferably by electronic means, the UDI for Class 3 implantable devices and devices that the Commission may publish from time to time that need to be included in that category. So moving on to the requirements of the notified bodies, one of the things that you'll really need to keep in mind is that you need to assess the potential of your current notified body. Can it be properly re-notified, and what is their reassessment plan? Remember, I stated that it's going to be difficult for some of the smaller notified bodies to be recertified, and so there may be a supply problem with regards to notified bodies. So you're going to want to make this assessment quite early on. You want to discuss your notified body capabilities and see whether they have the ability to meet the new requirements under the MDR and what their timelines would be to meet those requirements. And if you do need to move to a new notified body, you'll need to analyze who is available as notified bodies and really prepare for a change and transition of those certificates. Keep in mind that the supply for notified bodies is going to be tight, and already notified bodies are finding that they are filling up their capabilities quite quickly. Notified bodies have been subjected to additional scrutiny by the authorities, and they also have increased workloads due to the unannounced audits that they're currently required to make. So we are finding that many of the smaller notified bodies are going out of business as these requirements really bind them and make it impossible for them to meet the regulations requirements. So we'll find that there's a shortage of capacity and expertise, and we'll have a low notified body supply with a high demand. And we know that that will also increase costs. So as a company, you're going to need to plan on increased budgets for notified bodies and compliance to the CE mark requirements. The notified bodies already are experiencing delays in being able to make their reviews, performing the audits and certifications that they need to do. And these delays, of course, will affect manufacturers' reputation in the marketplace if you aren't able to keep your CE mark in place in an expedited manner. It may cause some companies to alter their research strategy or the introduction of new products as they're not able to have the notified body involvement to figure the classification on new technologies. I wanted to share this information from the MDR preamble with you. So there are key elements that the regulators were looking at, such as supervision of notified bodies and the conformant assessment procedures. They wanted to increase the requirements on clinical investigations and clinical evaluations, on vigilance and market surveillance, and they wanted to ensure that there was more transparency and traceability regarding devices that are going to be introduced into the marketplace. And this is all with the idea of improving health and safety in the European device marketplace. So the idea here is that the proper functioning of notified bodies is crucial for ensuring a high level of health and safety for those products and to give some confidence to the notified body and assessment system in the member states. So what are the requirements of the notified body going to be? Well, first of all, they have to show that they have sufficient expertise, facilities, and detailed documented procedures that will allow them to effectively conduct the conformity assessment activities that they undertake. They will have to show that they have a quality system and technical documentation in place for their activities and their operations. They will need to show that they have particular expertise in the areas of the type examinations or the product verifications that they undertake with their clients, and that they have preclinical evaluation assessment and clinical evaluation assessments that they're able to take a look at and ensure that everything is going to be in good order. The monitoring of notified bodies then is going to be undertaken by the national authorities, and that will include witnessed audits of the notified bodies. So now the national authorities are going to be coming in and auditing the notified bodies themselves. The monitoring will consider the data that's arising from market surveillance, vigilance, and post-market surveillance systems. So in other words, they're going to be looking into the reports that are going into the Eudamed, and they're going to be deciding what notified bodies need as monitoring activities. The national authority may also do on-site assessments and conduct short notice or unannounced for-cause reviews on notified bodies. So they may find themselves subjected to these unannounced audits. And the national authority is, that's responsible for notified bodies is required to assess the notified body assessments of manufacturers' technical and clinical documentation. So what that means is that the national authorities will be doing some spot audits on technical files that notified bodies have already assessed. So there's also an oversight requirement by notified bodies on these summary, safety, and clinical performance reports. These reports must be made available to the public via Eudamed. The following are the aspects that need to be included in those reports. So the identification of the device and manufacturer, which includes the UDI information, the intended purpose of the device, including any indications and contraindications, and a description of the device that includes reference to previous generations of devices, any accessories that go with them, other medical devices that they operate with, and so forth. Whether there's possible diagnostic and therapeutic alternatives, and a reference to harmonized standards and common specifications. So the summary of clinical evaluation and relevant information on post-market clinical follow-ups becomes very important in these summary reports, and there needs to be included a suggested profile that for training to the users of these products. Information on residual risks and undesirable effects have to be included in the reports as well. So what happens with these summary reports and the notified body involvement is that the draft of that summary report has to be put together and submitted to the notified body, who then looks at the report and validates the information, and then is required to upload that report into the Eudamed database. So you'll see there's a significant requirement on notified bodies in this area, and they will have a lot of responsibility and probably some liability for the information that goes into the reports. The manufacturer then is required to mention on the label or in the instructions for use where the summary report can be found in the Eudamed database. So the notified body then has to have documented procedures that ensure the confidentiality of information that they come into possession of during their work with the manufacturers, except where they're required by law to disclose that information. So they need to establish, document, implement, and maintain a quality management system that's appropriate to the nature of work that they do with their conformity assessment activities. So if you are going to apply to a notified body under the Medical Device Regulation, there are several steps that need to be undertaken. The notified body is required to publish a statement or a publicity notice that describes the application procedure that they have. That description has to include languages that are acceptable for submission of documentation and any related correspondence. And it needs to show that they have documented procedures that relate to the assessments that they will perform, and they have to disclose the fees that they will charge for those assessment activities. And they have to have documented procedure in relation to advertising their conformity assessment services. Distributors, authorized representatives, and import responsibilities are significantly increased under the regulation. These are now specifically regulated. The authorized representative role is more clearly defined and includes legal responsibilities. As I mentioned before, these economic operators have to obtain a registration number, so they're a part of that registration system that we discussed earlier. They need to become aware of their responsibilities and establish adequate communication among themselves to make sure that they can resolve product issues. And they need to establish audit procedures that include distributors, importers, and authorized representative responsibilities. So as a manufacturer, you're going to want to have audits on each of these economic operators that you are involved with. So under the classification and conformity assessment area, you'll want to perform a gap assessment against all the devices that you already have on the market and see how they fit into the new classification rules and see whether you're going to have to do reclassifications. There are some new rules that have been put into place. I'll talk about them a little bit more. So the substance-based devices come under the new Rule 21, and spinal implants are reclassified under the Rule 8. You'll want to perform a gap assessment under the new technical file requirements. Your existing technical files undoubtedly will need to be updated and added to. And then you'll want to perform a gap assessment regarding the changed essential requirements for existing devices. So your old essential requirements checklists will need to be updated to the new essential requirements. So under Rule 8, all implantable devices and long-term surgically invasive devices are in Class 2B. Now there are some exceptions. Most of these exceptions move them to a higher classification, as you can notice here. Class 3 primarily is the designation for most of these implantable devices. There is an exception for screws, wedges, plates, and instruments that are used in conjunction with spinal implants. And then the one exception that downclassifies these implantables are those that are intended to be placed into the teeth. The newly added Rule 21 is about products that have substances or combinations of substances that are intended to be introduced into the human body via a body orifice or applied on the skin. And these are generally going to be in Class 3 if they are products of metabolism or systemically absorbed by the body, or if they achieve their intended purpose in the stomach or lower GI tract. They're in Class 2B in all other cases except if they're applied on the skin, in which case they're Class 2A, or if they are applied in the nasal cavity and achieve their intended purpose in those areas. Finally, there are those products that previously have not had an intended medical use, and as I mentioned earlier on, these are being pulled into the medical device regulation, so they will have technical files that will be required for these. They include things such as contact lenses or other articles that will be introduced into the eye, products that are intended to be totally or partially introduced to the human body through surgically invasive means to modify anatomy or fixation of body parts, substances or combination of substances used for facial or other dermal or mucous membrane filling, equipment intended to reduce, remove, or destroy adipose tissues such as liposuction, lipolysis, and lipoplasty. And then high-intensity electromagnetic radiation equipment, such as lasers for skin resurfacing, tattooing, or hair removal. And then equipment for brain stimulation that apply electrical currents or magnetic or electromagnetic fields. Now, if you are working with your notified bodies and you can't come to an agreement with them on what the classification criteria is, there is a way to resolve those disagreements under the regulation. This requires some application to the member states where the manufacturer has their registered place of business, so the member state competent authority will intercede and help resolve those classification issues. If the manufacturer doesn't have a registered place of business or hasn't designated an authorized representative, Then the competent authority where the authorized representative would reside will get involved in making the classification assessment. And if none of that works out and you need to pull in the members or the medical device coordination group to help resolve issues, that's also a route that's available. So talking about clinical evaluations and clinical investigations, the first step is to really identify or understand what the new clinical requirements are. So you'll have to look at a gap assessment between your current clinical evaluation and devices under the new future model. You'll want to review your updated internal procedures for planning and commissioning clinical investigations if that's necessary. Define the devices that are clinically significant in clinical performance and safety, and decide whether a clinical evaluation is going to be effective enough or if you're going to need to move to a clinical investigation. And then perform a gap analysis of your current post-market clinical follow-up methods and the outcomes per device against the new requirements. So again, a big area of change in the whole clinical evaluation and clinical investigation area. And the notified bodies are receiving much more instruction and training on what they're going to be needing to look at in this area. So there are tighter requirements on clinical evidence, increased restrictions on the literature route. There's a much tighter definition of the word equivalent. Manufacturers have to show that they have access to the data on devices for which they're claiming equivalence. And so that can be quite a problematic situation. Of course, it's quite a bit like the equivalence discussion that we need to make for FDA when we have a predicate device and we're trying to get our 510K. For implantables and Class 3 devices, you can use other manufacturers' data if you have a contract in place with that other manufacturer for using their data. Of course, that may be very, very challenging. And then you need to take a look at whether you need additional clinical data to support the claims that you're making on your product. There will be more scrutiny, in other words, clinical evaluation reports by notified bodies, and the competent authorities, of course, as I mentioned before, will do some auditing of those requirements. And of course, some of you may be aware that there have already been some increased requirements placed by the new MedDev document that's out, the 2.7.1 Rev 4 document. So the manufacturer really has to justify the level of clinical evidence that they are using to demonstrate safety and effectiveness of their devices. If you have a Class 3 device, you need to consult an expert panel to determine which clinical evaluation and investigation methods you can follow. For a Class 3 and implantable, there has to be a clinical investigation with a notified body check of the post-market clinical follow-ups, and those will need to be updated annually. The sponsor, its legal representative, or a contact person must be in the European Union, and the investigator that's used in clinical evaluations must be qualified in the European Union. And it's very, very advisable to have this electronic system in place that will communicate the progress against the clinical evaluations. So things that are going to be looked at in the post-market surveillance, the surveillance and market surveillance reports. You're going to want to have a post-market surveillance plan in place with ongoing post-market clinical follow-ups and determining how you're going to get that follow-up information, how you're going to fold that in and include that in your post-market studies. You'll gather your post-market surveillance information as early as possible and really include any product that's currently based on equivalence. You'll need to make sure that you understand the new vigilance reporting requirements, including the new trending and reporting requirements that are in place under the regulation. So understand that the data that's gathered by the post-market surveillance activity is used to update the benefit risk determination and your risk management files. It may also be used to update the design and manufacturing information for the products, instructions for use, and labeling. So you will need to take a look at whether your clinical evaluation needs to be updated. Is there summary safety and clinical performance that you'll need to gather together and update that information? Do you need to identify corrective and preventive actions or field corrective actions? And if so, how will you coordinate and see those through and report them properly? You'll want to identify possibilities to improve the usability, performance, and safety of the device. So it's a constant looking into the performance of the device in the field and seeing whether you need to update or change the design of it. And will that contribute to the post-market surveillance of other devices that you have in the marketplace? And then you'll be expected to detect and report trends that have to do with the safety issues. So post-market activities are based on a post-market surveillance plan according to the requirements of the Medical Device Regulation. That plan then forms a part of your technical file. And the manufacturers of Class 1 devices need to prepare a post-market surveillance report that's updated when necessary according to the information that you're gathering from that post-market surveillance activity. Your Class 2A, 2B, and 3 devices have reports that need to be updated on a periodic schedule, and you will summarize information gained in the surveillance and describe any corrective and preventive actions that you've undertaken for those devices during that reporting period. The report needs to include a conclusion of the benefit risk determination and how you arrived at that determination, the main findings on your clinical follow-up report, and the volume of sales and an estimate of the population that uses the device that you have in the marketplace. Okay, so vigilance includes your reporting of issues in the field of your product. There are various time periods for reporting, and those time periods depend on the severity of the serious incident. So if you find that you have a serious public health threat with a product, that must be reported within 2 days of that finding. If there's a death or unanticipated serious deterioration of health from the use of the product, that reporting needs to be immediate but no longer than 10 days. You need to define how to manage these incidents and the methodology for determining the statistical significant increase in their frequency or severity. And remember that this information must be reported into the Eudamed database so that it's transparent to the competent authorities and to other people who access the Eudamed database as well. The competent authorities can conduct their own assessments and conduct their own trend reports to determine whether they're going to mandate some corrective actions. We'll move on now to CE Mark validity. So we'll talk about the implications for CE marking. One summary statement here: certificates that are issued prior to the final implementation of the MDR in late 2019 or early 2020 will have a maximum validity of 5 years. So remember, new CE marks will not be valid for longer than 5 years. However, CE mark that's issued before the implementation of the new regulations will only have a 4-year validity period. So a timeline for the transition here. Devices that are placed on the market under the existing Medical Device Directive will continue to be made available on the market for a period of 5 years. Certificates that are issued after the MDR goes into force, so presumably sometime during the early part of this year, will be valid for a maximum of 5 years, but void at the latest 4 years after the date of application for those certificates. And then certificates that are issued under the Medical Device Directive before the Medical Device Regulation comes into force, they're valid as per the certificate, except for Annex 4 certificates, and those will only be valid for 2 years. So it's a complicated area of transition. I suggest if you have certificates that are issued under various annexes or under the MDD versus the MDR, you really study these transition timelines and make sure that you understand how long your certificates will be valid. So the timeline here then, of course, shows Q1 2017 would be the medical device entry into force, so adoption of the regulation at that point in time. Presumably early 2019 will be the first MDR certificates that are issued by notified bodies. Remember, they're becoming qualified to issue certificates under the new MDR during that period of time. And then Q1 2020 is the date of application for the MDR, so 3 years after entry into force, meaning the 2017 date, and they're no longer going to be able to issue CE certificates under the MDD after that date. So certificates issued by notified bodies prior to the effective date of the MDR remain valid until the end of the period that's indicated on the certificate, except for the Annex 4 certificates, as we stated. And then certificates that are issued after the effective date remain valid until the end of the period indicated on the certificate, but not to exceed 5 years. However, they do become void at the latest 4 years after the effective date of the certificate. So things that you need to do in the transition: understand the transition options for the devices that you have placed on the market. If you have various types of devices, those transition dates can change. Apply the transition options to the devices that you have on the market during that 3-year transitional period. Determine products that may qualify for further period under the MDD certificate after the transition period, and provide for those in your transition plan. And finally, recertify your devices on certificates issued during the transition period under the old rules. So to sum up what we've talked about today, first let me say, of course, it's a very complicated regulation. As we stated, over 300 pages, a lot to absorb and take in. We're already working with a number of clients to help them understand how to transition from the MDD to the MDR. It's a huge undertaking. You'll want to make sure that you assemble a multidisciplinary team to take charge of that MDR transition. Know the regulation requirements. You may want to have some study groups within your organization to understand what those requirements are, and put project management in place. You'll need to identify detail that you need to think about in implementing the requirements under the implementing acts. And remember, some of those implementing acts have not been issued yet, so you'll need to stay on top of what's getting issued through the European Union over this next 3 years. Next, you'll want to determine if the new classification rules affect any of the products that you have on the market, and confirm the assessment, conformity assessment routes that you are engaged in. And take a look at your notified body. Do you need to change your contract with them? Do you need to change to a different notified body? Take a look at your documents, your technical documentation. Do a really good, deep gap analysis on that to see where you're going to need to change your technical files. Are you going to have gap analysis or gaps in your clinical evidence so that you'll need to do some clinical investigations versus a stronger clinical evaluation? Review your product portfolio and decide whether it's even economical to retain all of the products that you currently have under the new medical device regulation. And if you need to plan clinical trials, you'll need to plan those early on. And then finally, consider the impact on the rest of the world. How are these changes in Europe going to affect your registrations in other areas or other countries? You'll want to qualify and identify the personnel that you'll be using, the training that you'll need to put in place, and other investment needs of the organization. Establish and implement that project team, and make sure that you've increased your regulatory and QA budget for 2017 and beyond. There will be some additional significant costs in retaining the CE marks. So just an idea from our company on areas of expertise. We're involved in global regulatory support, includes all things FDA, EU, supplier audits, risk management, human factors engineering, and so forth. And I thank you very much for this time to be with you, and would be happy to address any emails that would come into me asking for additional information.